Hello and welcome to my video, where I'm going to show you how I decorated some very plain organisers using mostly wallpaper samples. I've recently been reorganising my craft supplies and I bought some basic cardboard box files and mini drawers as well as an MDF tape holder. All of these things are plain brown and very boring looking, so I thought I'd show you how you can easily upgrade the look of these on a budget. I have quite a selection of wallpaper samples thanks to some recent decorating, but if you can't get hold of any wallpaper, feel free to use any other type of thick decorative paper. Here is a list of all the items that I used to decorate these organisers. And with regards to the wooden tape holder, I found this on Amazon, but if you have basic woodworking skills, it wouldn't be difficult to make one from scratch. Right, so here you can see the MDF pieces for the tape holder, and I received 2 sides, a back, and 4 rectangles that will form the angled shelves. To start with, you'll need to prime the MDF. To do this, I just applied white gesso all over with a brush, except for in any areas that will later be glued. You'll see that I didn't paint the back, and this is because I'm going to cover it with paper. However, I learnt that even the thick paper is not entirely opaque, so my advice is to paint everything even if you will be covering it. Once the primer is dry, you can then brush on some acrylic paint of your choice, or you can use spray paint. If you're going to be spray painting, make sure you now cover any areas that you don't want to paint with masking tape. Then take all the pieces outside, put your breathing mask on and apply a couple of coats of spray paint. You only need to paint the surfaces that will be visible in the finished product. At this point, take the time to check that all the pieces fit together easily, as you might need to do a little bit of sanding now if they don't. The next 2 steps of the process are to add the wallpaper and also to glue all of the pieces of the tape holder together. I kind of did both of these steps in one go, and even though it worked for me, I think it's probably best to take a different approach. How I did it was I used wood glue to attach the sides to the back, and then I immediately used a single sheet of paper to cover the inside of these 3 pieces. You'll notice that I used a clear all-purpose glue to attach the paper, and that's because it's stronger than PVA glue, and also because I was worried that the PVA glue would absorb too much into the paper. Please note that if you're using a thinner paper than I am, you might need to use a different gluing method. For instance, you might need to decoupage the paper onto the wood, or just use double-sided tape. Once I'd pressed the paper down all over, I then cut holes where the shelves needed to go, and then glued the shelves in place. However, since I'd already glued the sides on, it took a bit of force to attach the shelves. Therefore, what I suggest is that you instead cover the inside of the back and sides with separate pieces of paper first, making sure to not add paper where the pieces will be joined. Once you've glued all the parts together, put a heavy weight on top of the side and leave the glue to dry. My shelves didn't butt up against the sides as closely as I expected them to, so I then needed to paint the edges with gesso. And then all that's left to do is to use your craft knife to trim off the excess paper. To do this, first use your scissors to cut from the edge of the paper up to a corner of the wood. Then, making sure your craft knife is sharp, drag the knife through the paper whilst against the edge of the wood. Do this carefully and use a slicing motion. As an optional extra, you can then cut out a few rectangles of thick felt and attach them to the base of the tape holder using strong double-sided tape or glue. So that's it, the ribbon holder is now complete. And now it's time to decorate the box files. First, you'll need to spread a thin layer of PVA glue onto one of the large sides using a paintbrush. Then lay your piece of paper onto this side and press it down all over. You'll want to have at least a few centimetres of excess paper at each edge. I think it's a good idea to use a stronger glue around the outside edges to make sure that the paper is stuck down well. And then do exactly the same again on the other side of the box file. As mentioned before, you might need to use a different method of attaching the paper depending on the type of paper you're using. If glue is going to seep through it, you'd need to either decoupage the paper or attach it with double-sided tape instead. Next, you'll need to use a sharp craft knife, preferably with a new blade, to carefully trim away the excess paper along the diagonal edges. When you do this, it's best to hold the side of the blade against the card and use a slicing motion. At the front and back of the box files, keep about 1 centimetre of excess paper on each side. You'll need to wrap this paper around the corners and glue it down. I then use the same technique to attach paper to the front and the back. Note that this time you don't need to keep any excess paper to wrap around the corners, you can cut off all of the excess. In hindsight, what I should have done is, because the front and back are just simple rectangles, I should have measured those rectangles and then cut those exact shapes out of the paper. Then all I would have had to do is glue these pieces of paper in place and I wouldn't have had to trim off any excess. Speaking of trimming, I then had to use my craft knife to trim around the outside edges. On the seam lines between the two pieces of paper, I needed to use small scissors instead to get a neater cut. Also remember, you need to use your craft knife to trim inside the hole at the back of the box file. You can then apply decorative tape neatly along all of the outside edges. You can also put 2 strips at the back where the paper pieces meet, unless you've cut the paper neat enough to not need to do this. I found that because my wallpaper is textured, the tape did start to peel off in a few places, so I ended up using some glue to stick it back down again. Therefore, if you're sticking the tape onto a textured paper, you might want to think about using glue as well. As you can see, I also decorated another box file, but this time with a tropical theme. The next step is to add an acetate lid to the box files, and that's just because I hate getting dust in box files. However, this is an optional extra. Before you make the lid, you're going to have to plan how you're going to make it. This will involve taking measurements from the box file and also working out how it's going to go together. In total, I needed 2 rectangles and 2 triangles, all with flaps on one side where the pieces needed to attach together. And the strip that I need is too long to be able to cut out from one piece of acetate, so I needed to make it from 2 pieces. There are a few lines where I need to score lightly with a craft knife, and these are the places where the acetate needs to fold. So that will be next to the flaps on the triangles, and also where the strip meets the front or the back of the box file. Please note that when I'm marking out these shapes, I'm using a dry erase marker because it can be later removed from the acetate. Once all of those pieces are cut out and scored, you just need to glue them all together. I did this using a clear all-purpose glue. This lid includes a strip of acetate which will be pushed down the back of the box file, and this will be enough to keep the lid in place, no gluing required. You'll likely need to just trim down the sides of this section though, so it fits snugly without bending. And that's it, the box file is now complete. And then finally, we're on to decorating the mini drawers. If you intend to add different handles to these drawers, you'll first need to fill in the gaps at the front. To do this, just cut out some pieces of cardboard the same shape as the gaps and glue them in place. Please note that if, unlike me, you want to change the edges of the cardboard to a different colour, then I would recommend painting them at this point before you add the paper. To do this, I would just use acrylic paint. Then, using the same method as with the box files, I spread a thin layer of PVA glue on the side of the drawers. I then pressed the paper onto the glue all over. Unlike with the box files, I measured out the exact size of paper I needed prior to attaching it, as then I didn't need to trim the paper whilst it was attached to the drawers. Just make sure that you leave a little excess paper at each end though, to wrap around the top and bottom corners. Make folds in the paper at these points before attaching the paper to the drawers, so that you get a clear fold line, and that makes for a much neater finish. Then just repeat the same for the other side. Then do the same for the drawer fronts, again measuring and cutting the pieces of paper first. In order for the pattern on the fronts of the drawers to all line up nicely, I would recommend cutting out the pieces of paper one on top of the other, like so. I left a little excess paper at the top to fold over each drawer, but just make sure that if you do this, the drawers won't fit too tightly. Once those pieces of paper have been glued in place, just leave them to dry. Use this same method to cover the back and the top of the drawers, except this time you don't need any excess paper. Then it's time to use strong glue to attach the drawer pulls, one in the centre of each drawer. And then finally you can add some little labels. And that's it, all of the organisers have now been decorated. As you can see, it's quite a simple process and I think the results are well worth the effort. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and thank you very much for watching.